I'm Bianca Cotton, host of Behind the Confident Smile, where we inspire women to walk in love, live in hope, and be healed from past hurts. And I am here with Crystal Turner. Fabulous! She is a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and we are about to dig into what it means to heal mental illness.
Hi, Bianca.
Hello.
Nice to be here.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
For such an imperative conversation that is impacting our world more than ever.
Absolutely.
So I like to journey back. What was your earliest memory of seeing someone with mental illness? Whether it was called that or someone said something not right with them. Like, what's your earliest memory?
Oh, wow. So I would definitely say in my home. And yes, I didn't call it this. I didn't recognize it as this, but I knew something wasn't right. So I really remember, particularly in my home, I was the youngest of 4 kids, and I lived with my mom and my dad. And I remember particularly one morning waking up to my whole family like cleaning up and music playing, and you know, my mom's cleaning the house, my siblings are cleaning and doing their chores, my dad is putting food on the grill, and I'm like realizing that we're about to have this card party that we have every now and then, and I'm the youngest. I'm getting used to this tradition, and I'm having this take charge attitude, going behind my mom, cleaning up after her when she's definitely cleaned up well enough, bossing my older siblings around, and just really excited for this time that we're gonna have. And so as the day progressed and people came over our home, we really had this good connection with our family, my parents, their friends, good music, good food, and the whole day was good. And I remember distinctly hugging my parents and going to bed and really thinking about, wow, this was a great day. And falling asleep, and in the middle of the night being alarmed and woken to an alarming sound, and it was the sound of arguing and like really angry voices and crying. And I was really confused, didn't understand what was happening. And as I listened in more, it was my dad who was so angry. And I remember thinking, you know, why is dad so angry? And is mom okay? Because she was the one who was crying. And I was literally in that moment being awakened to the fact that my family was dealing with domestic abuse. And it was my real first introduction to fear. And what was happening was my dad had an issue with drinking, and after that event, you know, he would explode, and those situations became more frequent in our home. And it started to create an environment of anxiety throughout everyone in the home. And I was really seeing before my eyes is my dad was dealing with trauma because he had a lot of difficult experiences in his past that he had never spoken about. But the way that he was coping with it was through using alcohol. And so I was seeing 2 sides of it. I was seeing him when he was sober and how he had challenges dealing with dynamics, and how when he would drink, everything would come out and it would just be very explosive. Didn't know until many years later what he had experienced, and to have a whole picture to say, oh, this was trauma that was impacting our home, which is a form of mental illness. So that's really my first introduction to any form of like mental instability. Yeah.
So as a child, what do you do with this?
Yeah, so interesting, because I think it's a big part of trauma. Oftentimes it's something that does happen in our childhood. And when you're in an environment where it becomes normal, there is this inkling in you that knows something isn't right. But at the same time, it's becoming normalized because it's happening so often. But I think what happened first is that I really started not knowing how to relate to my dad. And a fear began to grow. And from that fear, anxiety began to grow. And I started to take that anxiety outside of my home, you know, and in all capacities, I started seeing things from this angle of fear. So in my social environments, I became much more withdrawn. I don't know if when I first started, I was very feisty as a little girl, kind of bratty, a little bossy. But as these experiences started to happen in my outside world, I just became more withdrawn and timid and afraid of the possibility of like chaos happening, even though I wouldn't have defined it like that. So as a young girl, that's kind of like how I navigated. And I didn't talk about it. Our family didn't talk about the experiences, so I also didn't talk about it. I think as I got older in my teenage years, I started to do things that society says you should do to feel better, because I was really dealing with anxiety, some depression. I was emotionally eating. And I started doing what society says you do, which is to get a good career, be successful in your studies. And so that's really the angle I took. I went to college and I, really dug deep into my studies. And I graduated and I started doing all the things. I purchased a home, I purchased a car, I had children, got married, got a bigger home. But every time I did any of those things, and once the excitement died down, I would always be met back with like this underlying fear and depression that was just, it followed me throughout the course of my life.
So at what point did you say, okay, I see this cycle. It has to stop today?
Oh, good question. I remember really, ironically, not naming it, but just understanding how I felt and understanding how very much so after no matter what I did, I always felt this feeling of not being good enough, not being valuable, being afraid, and I do remember very distinctly asking out. Maybe I was asking out to the universe, like, help me to really deal with these feelings of inadequacy. So that's when I first really intentionally called out to like, show me something different. If there's something different that I should be doing, show this to me. And the first thing that really came to me was a friend of mine was going through some health issues and wanted to go on this plant-based diet. And I supported them. I went on that journey with them. Making all these meals, being all excited about like just trying new things. And in my mind, the benefits I was going to get was to lose weight, clear my skin, because that was an issue back then. But the first thing I actually noticed is that my anxiety and my depression, they both decreased. It was actually the first thing that I noticed, which piqued my curiosity and it got my attention.
Really? From a plant-based diet?
And really thinking about what that means, right? Because there are so many ways we can eat when we're not eating dairy or meat products that can still be unhealthy. But I was really getting more, I didn't eat well at all, you know what I mean, previous to that. And incorporating like things that were helping my digestion and getting more vegetables, just getting more nutrients. I was intentional about the way that I ate. I was going to get more actual nutrients into my body. And I definitely, those were my first experiences that was like, wow, like I didn't put a finger on it at first, but then I'm like, what's different with me right now? What's causing this? And that was the link. That was the link.
So that link led to what next?
So when that happened, it made me more curious to understand, because a lot of the people I was following to get guidance were more African-centered, I would say, in terms of their approaches. So it made me just want to focus more on the cultural part of Black people. I wanted to get more understanding of what else could I learn. And I came across principles that some people from traditional lineages utilized. And those traditions and those principles really talks about how to use your mind as a tool rather than allowing our mind to use us, which is definitely what my experience had been. Like my mind was pulling off of all of my past experiences and it was leading the charge with me in my life. So everything I saw was from this lens of fear because I had dealt with so much of it early on in life. Yeah.
On the fall season premiere of Chicago Newsroom 2.0, we'll take a closer look at the city of Chicago's looming budget crisis and the rising tensions between the CEO of CPS, the mayor, and the Chicago Teachers Union. Join the conversation on CAN-TV Cable Channel 19 or stream live on cantv.org or on the CAN-TV Plus app. Hyper-local news and critical analysis. Experience the power of community television.
What principle helped you to not look at life through a lens of fear. And then when we talk about practicing that principle that you're about to share, how long did it take you not to see life through a lens of fear?
That's a good question. Ooh, that's a good question. I would say one of the first principles, because there are several principles that I tend to follow, and I'm open to so much more that comes beyond that. But initially, the first principle that really caught my attention was this principle of correspondence that really talks about as above, so below, and as within, so without. So I had to understand what that meant, and it really talked about really what we're holding within ourselves, how we're feeling deep within, because you really can't hide, you can't lie about that. It's there. But what you're feeling in the deepest parts of you is what you tend to experience on the outside world. So for me, I dealt with a lot of rejection, and this idea that I just wasn't liked and I wasn't valuable. And I tend to, at that time, attract people who kind of mirrored that. If it was a friendship where if they maybe weren't the best friend, if it was in a relationship where I felt I was giving so much more and I wasn't receiving, but it was definitely what I noticed I felt within myself. I did see that. And it took time for me to work through that, right? And to start to be intentional about, if I know this to be true, what do I want to start practicing, replacing some of these feelings I'm having? What beliefs right now can I start to develop that I can really believe and tune into that to see how that plays out for me? For me, it may have taken a year for me to really start practicing it. I think that when you practice something, you can get the benefits right away, but it's the patterns that we're so used to living in that challenge us. You know what I mean? That challenged me. So it took me, after learning a lot of information, it was like, okay, now you're learning this, you hear it, you read it, but now you have to apply it. So it took me that amount of time to apply it. But once I started applying it, I could see the shift. And it's still a process because, when you've dealt with 35 years of a certain pattern, it can be easy to fall back into certain patterns. If you're not intentional, if you're not doing things from a level of awareness, we just fall back into those patterns. So it can take practice and consistency with those practices to start developing new patterns.
So with sitting with yourself is what it sounds like, sitting with yourself, and this is how I really feel about myself, and I'm attracting how I feel about myself. But now that I'm aware of it, it can help me to start healing the anxiety and the depression because now I'm more mindful.
Yeah.
At any point in your journey, did you take medication to help with depression and anxiety, or was it purely from my mind is powerful and I'm changing my diet and I may be incorporating exercise?
Yeah. Before I did change my diet, I was in school. I was in school for my master's as a nurse practitioner in psychiatry, and I did with the colleague that I was working with. They evaluated me and they did give me an antidepressant to try. That particular antidepressant didn't necessarily do anything for me, but knowing so much more about medicine, even if I was to look back at that, it wouldn't have been what I had selected for myself. But that particular antidepressant, it didn't do anything for me. Now, that's not to say that it doesn't work for people, because there are plenty of people who I prescribe antidepressants to, and for many people, it does help them to be able to deal with what they're experiencing emotionally at the moment. But what I really practice and support people in their journey is understanding that even a diagnosis of depression or taking an antidepressant, it may be what a person uses in their acute state when things are really volatile for them and it's really challenging. But beyond that, it's really going to be getting to the why of why we're depressed. Depression isn't the root issue, is what I'm saying. And a lot of times in our culture, it's looked at as like, oh, well, it's depression, so that's why you're feeling it's depression. But when you look at certain types of medicine and go deeper, it's like, well, depression is a symptom of something deeper. For me, it was the symptom of the trauma that I had experienced that I hadn't been processing. I hadn't gotten understanding of my dad or forgiven that, or just even with understanding his experience, a lot of forgiveness and empathy can come back and also be healing to you. Well, it was healing for me, I'll say, because everyone's experience is different. But I do really understand, especially when there's these generational patterns of pain. When those things were happening with my dad, I had no clue what was happening. But when I got insight later, and it's like, oh, wow, he went through these dynamics. It doesn't excuse his behavior, but it helps to understand it wasn't my fault. It was really his experience that was spilling over into everyone around him. So yeah, it was really important to really dissect that part for me.
I'm Ricky Watson, and I'm inviting you to join me for another episode of Critical Conversations. Each month, I'll share space with special guests who, like you and me, are on their journey of self-discovery and deeper understanding. Join the conversation on CAN TV, cable channel 19, or stream live on cantv.org or on the CAN TV Plus app. Elevated conversation and storytelling. Experience the power of community television.
So it sounds like one step in this journey of healing mental illness is getting to the root, getting to the why, and understanding where it comes from.
Yeah, and that's like based on another principle that I practice is really cause and effect. Like everything has a reason. You know what I mean? There's nothing that's happening just because we may not know the reason, we may not understand the reason. But I think with that African proverb of knowing thyself, meaning studying self, we can start to trace back, like, where is this coming from? When do I recall first feeling these emotions and what was happening? You know what I mean? And a lot of times it can be challenging depending on a person's experiences, right? But it's still an important part of the puzzle to moving beyond it.
Would you encourage someone to journey alone in that? And what I mean by journey alone is either journaling or writing or dancing, trying to, whatever the way that they can express themselves, or find a therapist or a psychologist. Like what could be a starting point after someone acknowledges, okay.
Yeah, that's a good question, because it's both of those, right? There's a part of healing that no one can do with you, but there's this other part of community that's so important, you know what I mean? And being able to find what speaks to you in terms of community. So when it comes to someone who's dealt with like trauma, or like, sometimes I use the word adverse experiences, because everyone doesn't, I didn't relate my childhood as traumatic, because I had a stereotype of what trauma was, or one perception of what it is. You know what I mean? Someone who's in a natural disaster, an Army veteran, you know what I mean? But a lot of times our childhood experiences, they become so normalized, it didn't feel good, but we don't realize that it was actually traumatizing. So I think that a big part of that I've really found to be helpful is therapy, and understanding that there are so many types of therapy. Sometimes people shy away from therapy because some types of therapy, it requires you to go back and deal with the very specifics of a pain. And I don't know that that's necessarily always necessary. And some people will never go to therapy because they are just not going to revisit the level of the pain that they may have experienced, So, but every therapy is not about that. You know what I mean? So I do think that therapy can be very impactful. And other modalities that might not be like the traditional therapy, but there can be other healing modalities that a person might find aligns for them and it's helpful for them. And that's why I think that know thyself is so important, because it's going to be individual, and you're able to explore things for yourself and say, for me, this has been helpful, even if it wasn't helpful to the person sitting by me. This this was helpful for me. Even if this didn't have evidence-based research around it, if I've experienced this and utilized this practice and this has brought me some level of peace, then that means for me, then this is helpful. But there are so many different types of ways to explore healing, and journaling is big for many people. Yeah, movement and dance is big for people. Expression and being able to talk things through is very impactful for people. But it really does take that part. One of the things that was so important for me is to start being curious enough about myself. Oh, I'm touching that. Curious enough about myself to really be able to start understanding me more,
What does it look like to be curious about yourself? Like if a person's like, how do I be curious about myself?
To really want to understand what impacts you, or how something is impacting you. A lot of times when a person is dealt with pain, one of the things that we're looking at is, first of all, this pain came from outside of us. Right? So then our attention starts to be toward everything outside of us, even including our healing based on other people's response or other people maybe taking responsibility for something that they did, you know what I mean? And it gives so much power to the outside world that it's not where we really have that level of control. But to be curious about yourself, I think is first to turn inward and start you personally giving yourself attention. Taking the attention away from the people outside of us and taking the attention to yourself. The things that we want from other people, to start giving that to ourselves. And I think the first part of that is to really start deconstructing a lot of negative opinions or ideas of self that we may have gathered from people outside of us in the first place. So when we really start to love ourselves, then we naturally become more curious about us. We want to know about us. When we love someone else, we're all about them. We want to know all about everything that they're doing. But when we love ourselves, it's the same thing. When we begin to love ourselves, then we become curious about, well, what makes me feel good? And also, what makes me not feel so good? Or, how does this thing impact me and make me think? Or when I'm in this environment, what am I thinking about? Where when we're at a place of not being empowered, we want to know what other people are thinking about us when we're in certain environments. Rather than being that, we're switching it up and we're saying, when we're in an environment, how do I feel in that environment? So it's a lot of checking in with yourself and really being this inspector of your own life.
I like that, being an inspector of your own life. So being an inspector of your own life, getting to the root of the issue, getting curious about yourself, sounds like it sets the groundwork for a life of healing and opening up the door to joy.
Yeah.
And maybe even lessening burnout, right? Because at this point, now you know yourself a little bit more. You may say no to things that you once said yes to.
That people-pleasing thing that we can do is a trauma response that a lot of people have when we've dealt with pain is we want to please everybody else. But now, we want to please ourselves, and having those boundaries, and also being now at this point where you're creating from a different angle and a different lens. We're always creating, but we can be creating from a lens of pain. But then we can be creating from a place where now we're content with who we are, we know who we are, and now it's like, well, what does this person that I'm now more identified with in a loving way, what does he want or what does she want? You know what I mean? And creating then from that lens.
So, Crystal, what do you want, right? Like when you think about from childhood to now, what do you want, and how does that inform the rest of your years to come?
That's such a beautiful question. I think I want to be back in touch with that vibrant version of myself before pain happened, because there was this version of me that I didn't really care about what people thought. You know what I mean? I didn't care about people's opinion about me in that way, where it caused me to stifle my movement. You know what I mean? And I wasn't afraid to speak what was true for me. I wasn't I wasn't afraid to delegate, like these things that we might need to do in our adult life when we're managing a thing or doing a thing in our life, delegating our own life even,
That
so
part.
yeah, so I wanted to get back to that version of me. Because I think for many people, that version of the most authentic you was there, but there are layers of experiences that are over that then is what's leading us in those moments. You know what I mean? So it's like peeling back these layers to get back to that authentic you. If you could ever think about the version of you before you experienced some type of immense pain, what was that person like? And so for me, it is getting back to that version because she knew what she wanted, and that person is going to experience the life that they want.
So as we come to a close of our time together, what would you say to the 7, 8-year-old Crystal while she was being introduced to fear and anxiety?
Yeah. I think I would say to her, learning and understanding is going to bring you a lot of freedom. So rather than closing off and running, is to understand your emotions, to not run from the emotions that you're experiencing, and to also express them. I think even with the experience with my dad, even though I don't know that I would have been the person to do that, but to have had conversation, right, would have given so much awareness to the whole family on what his pain was. And it could have brought a whole different dynamic. You know what I mean? So that experience has taught me in my life to express myself and be in touch with who I am and be honest about it, because being honest with myself first is going to be the most important thing, but you'll be surprised how many people will come along and support you when you just come from that authentic place.
Well, y'all heard it. Be honest with yourself first. That's one of the many first steps and gems that Crystal has shared with us today. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having such a healing conversation and opening our eyes to the journey of healing and demystifying, right? Making it practical for everyday people.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to speak and share that. It's really, even a conversation like this is healing. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you all for tuning in today.